we've got a running Storm cluster up in Kubernetes across 2 Kubernetes clusters. And they're both just sitting there idle at the moment, so we need to deploy a topology. In this model, topologies are deployed as part of a Kubernetes deployment, and they're immutable. So if we want to deploy a new topology, we redeploy the pod, which will pop the topology into the cluster, run side by side with the existing topology until you delete the old topology. So the topologies are delivered by pods. We never log into the Storm cluster directly to deploy anything. And to do that, basically a pod runs into the cluster. As you can see here, the pod's running up, and this one's initializing, and now it's running. And once it's delivered the topology into the cluster, it'll say completed. And so we can see the logs on that guy, we can find out what's happened and things like that. You might notice that the topology in Melbourne, however, has gone in and it's sitting there waiting on init. What's actually happened is the heartbeat service has prevented that pod from coming up because the heartbeat in the Sydney version of the data center is actually alive and kicking. And so there's no reason for it to pull into the Melbourne data center because it's not a failover event yet. Now with the pod in there, we'll go back to the Storm UI here, and that's in this. This is the looks to be the Melbourne version of it, and there's no topologies running there. If we switch across to the Sydney version, we should see it running topology and see here's the topology here, and we can see that it's actually processing events. I've got an event generator here that's firing events off one every couple of seconds into a pipe, and it's actually not doing it at the moment, so let's get that going again. Fire them in. Okay, there we go. We have events running in the pipe. I've got over here also a sample app that's showing the events come out the other side. And so as an event goes in, you can see it come out the other side of the pipe. What this app is showing here is that there's different users going through. We get a user ID. The start of the pipe, we just have user ID. And then as the various enrichments complete, as the various bolts complete, the event stream becomes enriched. And so service 1 adds the username and the user segment. Service 2 doesn't really do anything, but we'll have a look at that in a minute. And service 3 also doesn't actually enrich, but they have a purpose, which we'll demonstrate soon. But you can see that service 1, the first bolt is calling service 1 v1. Service 2 is service 2 v1, and service 3 is service 3 v1. And what we're going to demonstrate now is the ability to configure intelligent routing in the cluster without actually having to redeploy any of the apps. And so the service routing is done by Istio in the cluster as opposed to being done by the apps themselves using configuration. And so it's a nice way to break up the dependencies, break up the responsibilities of the app into things that make more sense. So no longer do the apps have to know all the routing logic and everything to find different versions of servers, and you don't have to configure the apps to go and to now route to v2 or something like that. The cluster does that instead. So what I can actually do is, for a start, what I might do is I might say, hey, I've got a script here. Now, even though I'm running a script, it is actually deploying a file into the cluster. So it's not actually running a command directly on the cluster. And so the idea is that you build that file and you deploy it using DevOps principles. But what I want to do is I want to say service 1, start routing to v2. And so we've got v2 of our service in there. And after a second, this will take probably around 10 seconds to deploy into the cluster. My thing stopped emitting again. Okay, there we go. Okay, and so we can see there it's running, service 1 is now on v2 of that service. So I'll switch it back to v1. Here we go. And we'll just wait a second and we'll see it jump back to v1 of that service after probably about 10 seconds. And there it goes, it's dropped back. Okay, so that's very good. We can switch between services at runtime. Here we go. No troubles. So what I'm going to do now is I'm actually going to uh, split some traffic between service 2 v1 and service 2 v2. So the idea is that you might have a new service that's passed testing, but you don't want to run it quite 100% just yet. You might just want to split, say, 30% of traffic to that service. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to run another script here, and I'm going to say, for service 2, SVC2, please send 30%, 70% to version 1 and 30% to version 2. So let's do that there. And then what we'll see is after a second, we'll see service 2 will start bouncing between V2 and V1. It'll be 70% roughly of version 1 of the service and 30% version 2 of the service. We should start seeing that bouncing around in a second. Okay, and so it's mostly on V2, but we can see here that it's still getting a bit of V1. Okay, so part of the enrichment process is that when the user is loaded from service 1, it gets given a segment of either 1 or 2. And what we've got is service 3 has 2 versions as well. And what I want to do is actually intelligently route based on the data that's coming through. So not just a pre-configured version 1 or version 2 split. I want to actually interrogate the message and route the user based on what's in the message. So what I want to do is send users with user segment 1 to service 3 version 1, and I want to send users with user segment 2 to version 2 of service 3. And so the pipe has enriched itself, it's got enriched data, and then it's applying that rich data later in the pipe. Okay, so it's another script. It's going to use 5 here. And so what I'm saying is service 3, if it's V2 is the primary hit, otherwise fall back to V1. Looking in this header, so the bolts send up the previously added fields through the enrichment process to all subsequent calls. So we've got this storm user segment, or strom in this case, and this is a regex, so it's just saying look for anything with 2 in it and route them to V2, otherwise route them to V1. So I'll just apply that, and then we'll see here that in a second, anyone with number 1 will get service 3 version 1, and anything with number 2 will get service 3 version 2. Again, and so you can see that the if it's user segment 1, it's getting service 3 v1. User segment 2, getting service 3 v2.